Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Scotonomics episode 28. And the first thing I'd like to do is welcome my co-host, Kieran Van Sweden. Hi, Kieran, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yes, not too bad. Any thoughts on today's budget stroke spring statement?
Yeah, there was quite a lot of thoughts. I thought that I would collate a few of them for our viewers. So, yeah, I have to say, on a personal level, the national insurance threshold will be beneficial for me. That will be really good for me, actually. But the Resolution Foundation indicates that middle income households will benefit the most. I'm not a middle income household, but I'm self-employed, so that's how it will benefit me. No VAT on solar panels and heat pumps, which is nice for people who could afford those things. I was surprised that those things had VAT on them at all. That seemed like a no-brainer to not put VAT on these things. The director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies noted that there's no extra money for health, schools or public services. And Richard Murphy noted that the Chancellor stated that bond interest or debt interest, as he likes to call it as well, was preventing him from spending more. But of course, Richard Murphy points out with some data that actually the bond interest has been going down. And as we know, this is really a choice that the government makes about really how much bond interest gets paid. So, that's a completely spurious argument on the Chancellor's part. Laurie McFarlane pointed out that inflation has soared to 6.2% this week, which is a 30-year high. And the Bank of England expects rising energy, fuel and food costs to drive it up to 8% within months. And so for low-income households, the scale of the price increase could be much greater. He also pledged to increase the Household Support Fund, which is established to help people through the winter and distributed by local authorities by 500 million. But this is peanuts, So with households facing a 38 billion hit due to rising energy bills, this is like giving someone pocket change to help them to buy a house. There were no windfall taxes on the big companies, which is just very typical Tory. We do expect that, but I think people thought that this time, maybe they would do a windfall tax, all things considered. 7% of the fuel duty relief will reach the poorest fifth of the households, while 33% would flow to the richest fifth. So again, another benefit for people that are more well off. Real average weekly earnings after inflation is taken into account are no higher today than they were in 2008. For those who rely on benefits, things have been even worse. And before the pandemic hit, real incomes for the lowest income households were no higher than 2001, 2002, thanks to years of sustained welfare cuts. And these are comments from Laurie Farland. I should interject as well. A report published this week, the Office for Budget Responsibility predicted that real household disposable incomes per person will fall by 2.2% in 2022-23, and that's the largest fall in a single financial year since the ONS records began in 1956-57. So in other words, the coming year looks set to be the toughest in living memory. So yeah, not very good news for most of it, but good for me on the national insurance threshold. So on a personal level, that was quite nice, but there's lots of things that are really not very good at all.
Well, that's a really good summary. Certainly, I went through Twitter and I saw that a lot of people who you would kind of class as being in the centre or on the right were up in arms at the budget as well. So it's not just people who are on the left who are saying that this is incredibly unfair and regressive budget. It looks like that's a pretty common belief right across the political spectrum. Well, tonight we have a wonderful interview with James Meadway, who was advisor to the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, and he's got a fascinating perspective on what's happening in Scotland. And we asked some questions around debt and deficit, the cost of living crisis. We interviewed him not that long ago, so it was a really relevant interview. I loved that. I was, really intelligent, incredibly interesting guy. I really hope you all enjoy it. It's a full hour and 7 minutes. I would absolutely love for you to stay with it because it is fascinating, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Kieran, are you ready to go? Will we get going with it?
Yep. Great interview. Enjoy.
James Meadway, thank you very much for joining us on Scotonomics. A former advisor to Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell and currently director at the Progressive Economy Forum. So thanks very much for joining us. So first thing I'd like to ask you, does the government tax to spend?
Does the government tax to spend? No, not really. That doesn't mean that it doesn't need to levy taxes or that taxes don't matter. But if the government wants to spend, it can just spend. There's often confusion about this, and some people get very excited when they realise the government can just sort of spend money without thinking through what the next round of consequences from that are. But at least as a sort of formal statement about how the world is, the government doesn't need to tax to spend. It can just spend money. Do
banks only lend out deposits?
No, banks never. I mean, modern banks never lend out deposits. The secret to a bank is that it has deposits as a sort of guarantee of its security and stability, and as something in emergency. It doesn't actually need the deposit to lend out. It doesn't take the money held in a vault somewhere and hand it over to someone else. That if you go to a bank and ask for a loan, what the bank does is create that loan on its balance sheet and then wait for you to repay it back, at which point the entire operation kind of makes sense. The two sides of the balance sheet add up. There's an asset, which it's created for the bank, which is the loan it's given to you. There's a liability, which is the deposit it's creating its bank account, but it's not actually lending out somebody else's deposit when you go and ask for a loan.
Did the Bank of England under Labour have a full employment mandate?
No, it's never had a full employment mandate. I mean, it's had the only mandate it had which was written and then adjusted slightly in the years since, but it was first written in 1997 when Gordon Brown, as Chancellor, on pretty much his second day in the job, or really very early on, said, right, we're going to make the Bank of England independent. It's sort of independent in some senses. And that's really saying that instead of he as Chancellor and perhaps advised by people would get to set the Bank of England's primary sort of monetary policy tool, which is the interest rate it charges on deposits that other banks make with it. This is the base rate, often just referred to as the interest rate. The Bank of England would set that, and he'll try and set it according to a mandate that the government would give the Bank of England. That mandate says you have to try and keep inflation to about 2%, in fact, exactly 2%. And this mandate, there's no full employment reference there. The Federal Reserve has a kind of mandate to say, okay, we should try and create employment as well, but it's never existed for the Bank of England.
Are you in favour of more subsidiarity for the United Kingdom?
Subsidiarity in the sense of just more power for different regional bodies, yes, as a rule. Particularly, I mean, I realise we're on a sort of Scottish broadcast here, but particularly inside of England, where there's this sort of enormous gap between Westminster government and then really not much else at all, and then a scattering of local authorities, into which there are now some mayors with fairly limited powers themselves. That if you're Andy Burnham up in Greater Manchester or Jamie Driscoll in the northeast, you have some things you can do, and a lot of what you can do is make a bit of noise. I mean, we saw that in 2021. I think Andy Burnham was very effective at arguing the case for the northwest during the coronavirus. But your actual powers are really limited. Nothing like what you get if you're the Welsh government or the Scottish government, for example. Both of which should have more powers as well, by the way.
Are you in favour of Scottish independence? Or I could phrase it, if you were Scottish, would you be in favour of Scottish independence?
That's an interesting one. It's I always feel it's a bit difficult to comment. That if you've got a big campaign for Scottish independence, and that might be something that you could support elsewhere, I don't think there's any reason for anyone in England to say, no, you can't have a referendum on Scottish independence. If people in Scotland want a referendum on Scottish independence, they can have one. And that means also if they want to vote for independence, that's a good reason to do it. What's striking at the minute is that I strongly suspect that, okay, the Conservative government says it doesn't want Scottish independence, and the SNP government says it does, but their actual enthusiasm for doing this, I detect, is waning over time. That's it's something to talk about at some point in the future. It's not something to deliver right now, and I don't know how long they'll be able to manage that balance between something eventually one day it'll happen in some form and actually trying to deliver it right now. Yeah,
that's the political dynamic to it, isn't it? But your thoughts, if you were Scottish, would you be in favour of Scottish independence?
I'd be strongly tempted, and I think people who try and support the union have a real job of work in their hands to make the case for it by this point. And it's underplayed, particularly in Westminster, just that there's a real sense of many different things going on there, just a sort of basic sort of national identity thing, the sense of democracy that's lacking, the idea that you could do something different if freed from what often looks like, and it's not unreasonable to view it like this, a complete shit show taking place in Westminster. I mean, that's not a driver just in Scotland. You see the same thing happening in Wales. You can see the same thing happening in those bits of England that we were just talking about, where you can look at whoever it is who's now the Prime Minister, and he's been a Tory for a long period of time, and it's currently Boris Johnson, and you can look at the sort of the succession of minor or even major catastrophes that happened there and think that this is a bigger problem than just changing the government. This is an institutional set-up problem, and that would lead you towards saying, well, devolution inside of England would be a very good idea too.
And if Scotland was independent, do you think it would be a successful, normal, well-functioning European economy like Finland, Denmark, or Norway?
But that would be the aspiration. There's no reason on paper why it shouldn't be. It's just that the process of actually getting there is hard. And I think that's on the people supporting independence side to say how it would happen. Because what you get at the minute is a lot of sort of dancing around some sets of issues about, okay, we'd all like to be Finland. I mean, if you say what would an independent Scotland be like? And everyone says Finland or Norway or Sweden or something, which is not unreasonable, right? To think that this is possible. It's similar population, similar, these are all sort of developed economies. There's lots and lots of things going on there. There's industry in Scotland. There's lots of potential. The Scottish government talks all of this up. You could see plausibly how you might get there, and much more egalitarian, much better public services, all this sort of thing. It's just the process of getting there. Once you start thinking, okay, well, what kind of currency are you going to use? What are you going to do about Scotland's bank liabilities? What are you going to do about the debt, the government debt that as part of the UK potentially exists for Scotland? Of course, the position of the SNP is you get rid of all of it. Would the British government let you do that? Potentially not. So there's this huge set of complications where actually what the SNP in particular tries to present as a break that will be quite easy, and then you just sort of turn into Finland in 20 years' time, is actually going to involve a real rupture and a break with how the United Kingdom operates and therefore how Scotland operates. And that break is going to be more radical than anything the SNP leadership like to talk about, to the extent that they actually, as I said, really want Scottish independence in any kind of useful day-to-day sense. I don't view it for them it is something as anything other than a sort of aspiration you'll get to eventually, rather than like how we're making this happen right.
That's a really good summary. And I think what we've tried to get away from in Scotland and on Scotonomics is this kind of polarised debate that as soon as Scotland leaves the United Kingdom, it's done for, because we're taking all of the oil and all of the whiskey and all of the salmon and all of the renewables, and this idea that our UK is done for. But on the other side, you've got this idea that if Scotland becomes independent, it's some kind of economic basket case, and it just won't survive, and it'll come back begging to Westminster again. And we're really trying to say to people that there's no evidence for either of those things happening. What the evidence points to is a continued state of our UK doing fine and an independent Scotland doing fine. And that's where we're trying to kind of narrow that debate. And as you've said there, James, I think it becomes more about how do you become the type of successful country you want to be, and what's the process, rather than justifying that you will be that type of country.
I mean, some of it is, for instance, you need to get into a more serious conversation about the distribution of wealth and income in Scotland. That you don't get to be Finland given the resources that you have at hand. I mean, you don't get to be Finland for a whole load of reasons, but at least part of that is, well, then your tax system is going to have to look different. That you're going to have to do something about inequality in Scotland, put it like that. That you're going to have to try and raise money from somewhere. That there may, depending on currency arrangements, be some capacity for this hypothetical independent Scottish government to try and raise money, to borrow money and this sort of thing, but there may actually be significant limitations on its capacity to do that. a new Scottish currency would be something that exists out in the world with loads and loads of other currencies. There's no guarantee that its value will be sustained in that world. It's not actually an easy thing to manage an independent currency in a world with lots of different competing currencies.
Now, I'd like to know a little bit more about your views. How do we deal with the cost of living crisis that we've got at the moment, and what's causing it?
Well, the first bit, it's sometimes easier to start with what isn't causing it, but sometimes gets talked up. I mean, people would have seen the comments by Andrew Bailey, Governor of the Bank of England, I mean, probably about a month ago now, which were quite, I mean, they sort of did, in some ways, did us all a favour in just kind of clarifying the argument and making it obvious that this wasn't an argument that was going to work, when he said, following the little economic model in his head, that inflation is going up, that means people should ask for less pay rises. Right, if you're going to get one at all, by the way. I mean, there's a kind of real sort of 1970s mentality here, where it's like you as a worker can, in your strong union, can just go off to your boss and demand a pay rise, right? Like that applies to almost no one in the private sector. Maybe in the public sector, it's a bit better. There are stronger unions, more collective bargaining. Private sector in Britain right now just doesn't really happen like this. You know, you get what you're given. You can argue a little bit more in some parts of the economy, but mostly you get what you're given. But even if that was the case, the inflation we're getting now isn't coming from what's happening inside of Britain. It's not coming. If you look at like 10 years of basically flat or falling real wages, inflation isn't being driven by massive increases in wages that are forcing these poor firms to have to put up their prices. It's coming because the price of gas that we're buying mostly from Qatar, or Norway for that matter, has gone through the roof. That has nothing to do with how much you're paying people in Britain. The price of food is going up because there's a drought or rather a frost in Brazil, and drought and fires in Canada. And this is even before, by the way, we get to the fact that Russia and UK produce 40% of the world's wheat exports, right? So there's going to be some disruption there. None of this has anything to do with how much you're paying nurses or teachers. So how much you pay people in this country does not affect the international price of gas or wheat or coffee or a whole load of other things you buy from the rest of the world. And that's where the inflation is coming from, primarily, at this point in time. So the solutions to that, to me, I mean, the most obvious one is first, everyone should get a pay rise. Maybe not everyone. I mean, maybe not Andrew Bailey, right, who earns £500,000 a year. But most people should be getting a pay rise. And given that inflation, on the official measure, is about 5.5%. I mean, by the way, in reality, most people are probably going to experience a rate of inflation above that, because that's an average number, which is supposed to summarise lots and lots of different prices.
And of course, it's relative. Exactly, it's relative, isn't it? It might be 10% for you, it might be 2% for someone else.
Exactly. So particularly if you spend a large part of your income on food, which would usually, typically, the poorer you are, the more of what you earn you have to spend on essentials like food and heating your house. Your personal rate of inflation will be way above that. But in any case, everybody in work should be getting at least a 5.5% pay rise, at least. And actually, it should be more than that to compensate for the fact you had 10 years of flat real wages, and by the way, 2 years of a sort of horrible pandemic at the end of it. So everyone should be getting more than 5.5%. One part of it. The other bit of it is that at least some of these price rises are directly politically determined. The reason, for instance, that people are going to be seeing a 56% rise typically in their heating bills, energy bills from April, is because Ofgem, which is a government institution, decided that it was going to move the cap on those energy bills up that much. So basically everyone's going to be paying £700 more a year, I think is the sort of average increase in the bill, which is a huge sum on top of everything else, by the way. In France, it's 4%. And the reason it's 4% in France is not because there's some magic thing about the French economy. I mean, there are differences, more energy from nuclear power, but the huge gap is explained by the French government saying, we're going to cap this at 4%, and the British government saying, no cap, we don't care, right? Or we don't care if it rises massively. This is politically determined. If the government wanted to stop that, it could. And if it wanted to force the costs of that not onto households, but elsewhere in the system, because the price of gas internationally has gone up, but you can protect households from that. You just have to say to someone else, you're going to carry the can. And when you see BP and Shell, between them making £40 billion profit last year, that is going to go up and up and up this year because the price of oil and gas is going up and up and up. That's where you should be squeezing. Squeeze those enormous profits rather than say to every household in the country, sorry chaps and everyone, you're going to be absolutely screwed. It's a political decision to do this, that where you land the costs of all this.
Well, before we ask the second part of that question, which is what will we do about it, I just wanted to remind you that Andrew Bailey, it wasn't just what he said, it was what he didn't say. And if he thinks that it's caused by the inflation is caused by there being too much money in the economy, he didn't say to companies to reduce their dividend payments this year, or companies to not pay their bonuses. He said that workers should ask for less or no pay rise this year. And I think that is a fundamental problem that we have with central banks, that there is that attitude. So would you agree that inflation also wasn't caused by the huge amount of spending that the government put into the economy over and during COVID?
I'd say that. I mean, there's a couple of things going on there, because this is quite, I mean, this is a very sort of old argument for why does inflation happen? Well, there's too much money being issued. Government has borrowed too much, printed too much money in the modern form.
Old but still current and believed.
It gets dragged up.
Yeah.
It doesn't really work. I mean, it doesn't really work. Well, just take the last 10 years that we've had since early 2009 in Britain. Something around £850 billion worth of quantitative easing, right? So that's money that the Bank of England has electronically created. It's a bank, and as I said, banks can create money. Central Bank of England can do this. That they've then handed out to major financial institutions in return for buying, effectively, government debt. I mean, that's the operation. So basically, it's a huge amount of new money that's moved into the system. Over that 10 years, inflation has variously been really quite high, about the same level as now, or it's fallen so much that it's actually been negative for a while, or it's been somewhere around the 2% target. The amount of money that's been created via QE doesn't have any impact. So when you had, for instance, the Bank of England, when coronavirus broke out, created a huge amount of additional QE, another 400 billion or so, and the 400 billion that was already there. Yes, it's a large amount of money. No, it doesn't necessarily feed directly into rising prices. And the reason that happens is because the money that's being created is not necessarily immediately being spent by anyone who gets it. That the operation of QE in particular has seen asset prices rise, so it's helped support rising property prices, which is massively to the disadvantage of anybody who doesn't own a home, and may not necessarily be that great for people who do if they have children who want to buy a house and that sort of thing. So but it's greatly to the advantage if you're speculating in London property, for example, right? So it's making rich people richer. That's the impact of QE. It hasn't had much impact on wider prices because that money isn't feeding into the rest of the economy. And of the QE that was created over the last year, some of it went into the rest of the economy, but it's compensated for the fact you had a lockdown and huge amount of activity just disappeared. It went to people on furlough, for instance. And that's just compensating for the fact you're closing down great chunks of the economy. It's not going to add to inflation. It's compensation for something else. So I don't buy the story. It can seem a bit superficially appealing that you've got all this new money and therefore inflation goes up. The inflation we're getting now is driven by COVID, the effect of the supply chain disruption for the 2 years that you had lockdowns and shutdowns, everything else happening. That's still playing out. You then have these sort of natural disasters, which I think is a completely underrated part of what's happening at the minute. If you have regular, increasing extreme weather, droughts and floods and wildfires and all the rest of it, it's not just food buy that gets affected, it's semiconductor production. It's heavily reliant on huge amounts of water. There's a drought in Taiwan. It's started to impact semiconductor production. It's feeding into the shortage of semiconductor chips that you've seen over the last 18 months or so. So that starts to turn into rising prices. These are all big disruptive events that have very little to do with how much money you're printing or how much you're paying people. And of course, the third one that's now coming is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is going to have this, and it's already having this enormous impact on the global economy, largely because those two countries between them are huge suppliers of lots and lots of basic, pretty essential commodities in one form or another.
We mentioned a little bit there around that no one's had a pay increase, but we kind of mainly focused on inflation and costs. Could we go back to that idea that to solve a cost of living crisis, you spend less or you earn more? What would be your view on where we are as a society in terms of the income that most people are earning through wages, and what can we do to increase that if we should increase it?
I mean, the sort of big picture on this is that the slice of the economic pie that is going to people who work has been shrinking for a long period of time. So if you take GDP, which is a bad measure in lots of different ways, but it gives you a good indicator of how big the economy is. If you take the share of GDP that's going to wages, it peaks in the 1970s at something approaching 60% or so going to work, going to wages and salaries. It's now down well below that. It's down approaching sort of 40%, that kind of level, depending on which figures you use for this. And it's been declining for a period of time. So the share of national income that is actually produced by people who work, that's actually going back to the form of wages and salaries, has been reduced. So one of the things you want to do, if you take the really big picture, is increase that share. So you don't just want to say, let's grow the economy. You want a redistribution in terms of the size of the slice that people are getting. And that's putting more money in people's pockets. That starts to address the standard of living crisis that they're starting to see already. There's a number of ways you could achieve this. I mean, one is to push up seriously the minimum wage, that a big increase in the minimum wage over and above, what's it now, it's about £9.80 an hour or so. It's supposed to be £10 an hour at some point. Now, given the current rate of inflation, it should already be moving above that. But a serious increase in the minimum wage would lift a lot of people out of the kind of poverty wages they're in, increase the size of the economic pie going to people who work, which is a fair redistribution, by the way. Incidentally, I mean, profits, certainly money terms, are pretty much at record levels. Right? It's not like there's no, you mentioned this, it's not like there's no money out there. It's just that apparently we can't touch this and we have to sort of scrabble around over whatever's left in the economic pie that's been allocated to workers. And it's actually, no, let's increase the size of the pie. Another one would be to just have stronger trade unions, more collective bargaining. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but as things stand, especially in the private sector, with union membership, it's down to what, 15% or so? And all that, by the way, a great chunk of it is former nationalised industry. So the actual private sector has very, very low rates of unionisation. Now, there are some promising signs, and this is one of the sort of side effects of COVID, that this might be picking up. For the last few years, actually predating COVID, union membership has been picking up. There are some signs that people are winning really big pay rises where they've been able to use a bit of leverage. Lorry drivers has been the most obvious example, but some hospitality workers, for example, and where they've been able to use that leverage and start to pull back, start to win back some power in the workplace, and therefore win fundamentally more money for themselves, what people I think are entitled to after years and years of this squeeze. So that's the basics of how you make it happen.
And I think we can see that. I think a lot of jobs in the economy have got so bad. I'm thinking of hospitality jobs, and there's been a few successes in Scotland where groups of hospitality workers have got together and have forced their employees to, things like give them their tips that are actually being paid, or give them notice on their shifts. But I do think that it's probably cyclical. The jobs get so bad that unionism becomes something that you have to do just simply to protect the basics of your livelihood. And I think we've got to that point with a lot of sectors in the economy that it really is that bad.
I hope so. I mean, my slightly more despairing view of this is that historically unionization happens because unions are already there, right? If you see what I mean, that because an organization has been built, it's easier to recruit more people into it. And that's how unions have grown over time. So they're very, very cyclical. Like you take the great run from really when they became sort of properly legalized is what, the 1860s, 1870s in this country. I mean, there's serious restrictions right the way through to all the way through to the 1940s, really. But there's this sort of cyclical pattern to their growth, which is determined by whether or not people go out and organize unions. So although, if you're sort of politically inclined and on the left, it may well be quite obvious to you that you go off and join a union if you're in a workplace. For great numbers of people out there, I think particularly for sort of younger generations who've grown up in a world where unions just aren't a feature of their lives, that if union membership in the private sector is that low, and there are surveys on this, that most people that work in the private sector are in a workplace without a single union member. So it doesn't even necessarily occur to people that joining a union is what needs to happen. So what should happen is unions themselves need to take the big resources they have and really push at organising on the ground, right? Which is starting to happen, actually, in fairness. United is making a big show of doing this with their new general secretaries. We hope they follow through. Some of the smaller, much smaller unions, the IWGB and others, then are already sort of starting to push this because there's an opportunity for it now. I mean, like I mentioned, one of the sort of after effects of COVID has been this, what seems to be a kind of tightening of the labour market. In other words, there's a bit more leverage people have because for all sorts of reasons, there's fewer other workers around to sort of compete for jobs and to compete for pay, right? So it's a bit of leverage and people should use that, and unions should be getting out there right now and demanding that they take more. And that should happen whatever else happens with war, with inflation, with all of these things. It is absolutely right and fair and just for people to say, after a decade of declining real wages, people deserve to be paid more. There's nothing wrong with that argument, and the various sort of excuses as to why this shouldn't happen, I don't think count for anything.
I just wanted to talk about unionisation in the private sector. It's really, really weak here. And, I lived in the Netherlands. It's much stronger over there. The catering is called the horeca. And it's very strongly represented, whereas, I've worked in lots of hospitality here, and it's just non-existent. I also worked for a well-known bookstore, and I was a member of USDAW, and I think I was the only person who was a member of USDAW. And when the manager was being hoisted over the coals, it was me he asked to sit with him, but he wasn't a member, so I think there was also a reluctance to imagine that you would withdraw your labour, because obviously you need to save to do that. You need to have savings to withdraw your labour. And I think when you're being paid poorly, it's very difficult to save that kind of money as well, and maybe have a holiday to get away from the very stressful job that's demanding lots of hours of you and not paying you that very well.
Yeah, exactly. And combine that with this I think, a real disintegration of the culture of unionism. That if you enter, I said, if you're young and just entering the workplace in the last 10 years, 15 years or so, I mean, much longer, you said 20, and it probably is about 20 years. It's just like you are not going somewhere where there's a bunch of other people who are in a union, or somebody who knows in a union, or it's obvious that unions are doing anything much. I mean, they exist quite robustly in the public sector. It's about 2/3 of public sector workers are in a union, but that's not like 2/3 of all workers. That's 2/3 of people in the public sector. That's a clear minority of workers. And even there are problems with recruiting younger people who go into the public sector to the unions. So this looks like, on paper, there's 6 million, 6.5 million union members in the country, I think, just in TUC affiliated unions at least. So it's substantial. But it's it's not quite a Potemkin village situation, but unless that starts to turn into recruiting younger people and actually winning visibly for people, like being able to say, this is why you should join. And that's a fairly hard-nosed, self-interested thing. You join a union, not out for good of your heart. Ultimately, you join it because it's good for you. And yes, there's a collective self-interest here, but it's still kind of a self-interest. Unless we start to win that, there's a real danger that unions just ossify entirely into something that somewhat older public sector workers do. I mean, you can see it happening already. Somewhat older public sector workers do. That's who they look out for. That's who they speak for. And everybody else is just left to their own devices.
Yeah. So, I mean, I want to go back to central banks. Do you think that they're functioning appropriately? Do you think they should do more? I mean, I also listen to central bankers as well. They tend to feel that the politicians expect them to solve all of the fiscal problems that they should be dealing with. Do you think central banks, I mean, certainly Andrew Bailey, got a lot of pelters, as he should have, to suggest that other people who are not on £500,000 a year should not ask for pay rises. But I mean, apart from that, in general, do you think they should function differently?
Generally speaking, yes. I mean, it depends on where you look and what the central bank is doing. There are some variations in how these things operate. Increasingly, actually, for a period since the crash, there's been a lot more sort of range of what central banks do across the world. In the case of the Bank of England, it has really quite a limited mandate. And you might want to think about, well, perhaps you could write some other things into that. I mean, you mentioned full employment. You might also want to think about, well, are there things that the Bank of England could do where, and this is something that the People's Bank of China doing it, is saying, well, we can make cheaper loans to green investments. So you quite deliberately start to try and steer what you're doing in that direction. Now, probably the best way to do this is actually to have the central bank give that money to some other institution which knows a bit better how to make this investment work. So you set up something like a national investment bank or regional investment banks to make that happen. But in principle, there's no reason why you couldn't do that. I mean, the other one I think it's a mistake for the Bank of England to do this, because I think QE over the last 10 years has been incredibly distorting in how it's actually played out. I mean, you touched on this. What's happened in practice is that whilst you have austerity, which is now sort of ground to a halt in the form of it was taking under George Osborne as Chancellor, that when you had austerity, which is sucking demand out of the economy because you're implementing all these big cuts, you had the Bank of England trying to squeeze demand back in through QE. It was just printing money, trying to prop up demand. And the result of that is that you compensate for austerity. You make austerity easier economically. That instead of you doing austerity in a weak economy, which by rights should lead to your economy getting weaker and weaker and you go back into recession, the QE that you're doing, with its limited but nonetheless real impact on demand, means that you can do austerity at the same time. So in other words, it plays a part in how the economy and society has been reshaped the last 10 years, and not in a good way, in a much more unequal way. Because as mentioned, one of the impacts of QE is to drive up asset prices. If you push up asset prices, people who own assets, particularly people who own lots of assets, get a lot richer, and that's what QE has done. So this impact of the whole thing is really quite unjust. Almost certainly it's played out in the last few years as we've expanded QE during coronavirus. But the Bank of England's really attached to it because, and Andrew Bailey, as he says it himself, is really attached to it because they see it as an essential prop for financial stability. Financial markets really like QE. And if you talk about, well, maybe we should move away from this and try and do something different or change how we do QE, perhaps we shouldn't just be buying government debt. We can think about trying to invest it, as the European Central Bank is now doing, by the way, in the European Investment Bank, that you're going to take this money and use it for different purposes and just basically buying financial assets of certain kinds. That panics financial markets, and we don't want that to happen, so we have to just keep the QE in place. And you can see this then informs the Bank of England's response to inflation, which is a sort of classic, if all you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail, which is they can't really do very much, so they're just going to jam up interest rates and hope for the best. I mean, that's what it boils down to. Now, as I said, if you've got inflation coming from abroad because the price of gas has gone up, food has gone up, all of these things are going up, you're changing the interest rates. It's like you trying to change wages. It's going to have absolutely no impact whatsoever on all this imported inflation. It's just pointless.
When the line manager, no matter what you would give her, she would make changes to it. She would circle half a dozen things with a red pen because she wanted to be seen to be doing something, justify her position. And that's what I think is happening at the Bank of England.
Exactly it.
There's egos, there's certainly egos there, but there's also well, we have to do something. This is what we'll do to make a difference.
It gets labelled as the bank's credibility, that it has to look credible in the eyes of everybody who's trading money and all the different sort of financial instruments out there. If it doesn't look credible, it won't believe any promises it makes, and that undermines its capacity to intervene in the economy, and therefore terrible things will happen. Like the pound will collapse in value because everybody running out trying to sell it because they don't believe the Bank of England anymore. All sorts of sort of doom scenarios that play out. So it has to look like it's doing something. So it sort of nibbles away at interest rates, knowing full well it's going to make very little difference other than signalling it's still there and trying to do something. And that's it. We can do better than this, right? You could have a government that was going to do a lot more fiscal policy, for example, and was a bit more serious about redistributing to workers, basically, from people who own wealth to workers. Now, this Tory government isn't particularly inclined to do that for fairly obvious political reasons.
The Bank of England and other central banks as well have a policy, the naira, which is saying it's okay to have 3% of your population unemployed because they're being paid to keep inflation down. Do you think that they should just get rid of that policy?
I don't think naira is a policy so much as a sort of description of how the world is assumed to work in these sort of central bank models. There are limits to what central banks can do. That if the central bank said, any central bank says, we will have full employment, there are kind of hard limits to being able to achieve that, which are becoming more apparent at the minute. So one of them, the big one really, is what's happened over the last few years, particularly COVID, but then, as I mentioned, this sort of environmental instability that's creeping into everything, is disruptions to the supply of goods and services in the economy. COVID is a huge disruption to supply, because basically you say to a bunch of people, you can't do your work anymore, you're going to have to sit at home. Now, if your central bank is trying to concentrate on changing demand to create full employment, but you're also saying, well, there's a real problem with supply, that isn't necessarily going to turn into more jobs for people. And beyond that, I think there's a bit of a question here about, I mean, look, we actually have pretty low unemployment right now. There are some weird things happening. Like one of the reasons here and in the US in particular, that you have these tight labor markets, that you have at least in some places, where you have suddenly there's more demand for certain kinds of work. You know, hospitality has been quite an obvious example, lorry driving even more obvious over the last year or so, because there's a limitation on the supply of labor all of a sudden. Some of the reason that's happened is because a whole load of people if you take last summer, more people quit their jobs than ever before since ONS, the official records, began, right? There's 900,000 people just lost their job, got another one. The Great Resignation. That's one part of it. The other part of it is loads of people just took early retirement. I mean, why is there a lorry driver shortage? Because it seems at least part of it is under COVID. A load of people just said, you know what, I don't necessarily want to carry on driving a lorry all day long for the rest of, for the next 10 years, what it might be. So a lot of people, when they had the choice of doing it, took early retirement. Now, that's not all positive. A lot of it is people were pushed out of jobs and haven't been able to get another one. And that is a kind of disguised unemployment. But the labour market in general has been shaken up. And I think we should probably work with this. We should probably think more about how can we, for instance, extend working from home to benefit everyone, you know, more people than it is currently. Because it's, to be honest, it's a bit of a sort of middle-class, white-collar thing, mostly, like for obvious reasons. It's quite hard to drive a forklift truck and say you're going to work from home. It can't happen. But if that can't happen, maybe we should think about reducing working hours for everyone. Why do we have a 5-day working week? Why not a 4-day working week? How can we make that happen? One of the things coronavirus has opened up is this range of possibilities about how we could organise the economy differently, and in particular, how we organise our working lives differently. And some of it's just happening anyway. I don't think working from home is going away now. You know, and coronavirus hasn't really gone away yet, by the way, but working from home isn't going away either. And lots of people are kind of using this and learning to work with that. And mostly for people who can do it, it seems to be quite popular. Similar thing with reduced working time. If you say to people, would you like reduced working time, no loss of pay? Lo and behold, everyone says, yeah, that'd be great. The difficulty that people have in their heads is, how can we do that without paying me less, right? And that's the bit where you get into redistribution, restructuring your economy, changing how the whole thing works.
So, yes, do you think that the Scottish Government is more progressive than the UK Government?
I mean, it's a low bar. Come on. I feel like that's quite a softball question. Do you think it's more progressive than Boris Johnson and the Tories? Yeah. It's not. Okay. so that's kind of dealt with, I feel.
Okay, so are there a few things that you think the SNP administration have done in Scotland that you would like to see the UK government copy?
I think that's an interesting question, because there's a degree to which, I mean, I just had just reading through, I've forgotten the sort of aspirational title of it, the Scottish Government's 10-year plan for, you know, the economy. Which has lots of sort of nice words in it, and then the actual content is a little bit short of matching up to those nice words. But in terms of what the Scottish Government has said it is committed to, things like a well-being economy and the idea that we're not just going to think about GDP forever, but actually the economy sits in a wider society, a wider environment, and our starting point should be, what kind of society do we want to live in? How do we make the economy match up to that? Not how do we make the economy work? Let's get society to fit into it, right? And well-being sort of captures that. And the idea of well-being accountancy, which the New Zealand government has introduced, is potentially quite a radical way to think about doing economics in general, and for governments to think about it. It can also be less radical. It's also just something you slap on and say, look, here's well-being, it's gone up 0.3, and it's like, well, so what? But if you take it in the round, it's like, okay, this may well involve exactly what I was talking about, thinking about how people work, where they work, when they work. How can you give them more meaningful flexibility about that? How do you alter, the so-called work-life balance? All sorts of things that can tie into well-being, or a well-being approach to this quite neatly. That's one thing there. The other bit is moving towards a Scottish investment bank. I mean, as mentioned, it would be great to have, certainly for England, regional investment banks of a similar scale. I mean, just on the population size, Yorkshire's bit smaller than Scotland, but why doesn't it also have an investment bank like this that functioned as a bank, as a public bank, so it could do what banks should do, which is create money in the creation of loans, direct those loans towards supporting small businesses, green investment, social investment of various sorts, and put that under the democratic control of people in Yorkshire or the North East or the North West or wherever it might be. I mean, that would be a meaningful version of getting power out of Westminster and the City of London and put it into the hands of the people in those parts of the country. Because you give me an institution that might do something, might actually have some power to reshape how the Yorkshire economy operates to the benefit of the people who work there, in a way that, frankly, Westminster governments consistently haven't been able to do. There's an institutional failure there, and the City of London has no interest in doing whatsoever. We know that on all the figures. It's why investment outside of London, the South East, certainly in England, is so weak. I mean, the interesting one in Scotland is how devolution since 1999 has changed that somewhat, that there's investment going to Scotland, and Scotland has closed, over some period of time, the long-standing gap with the rest of the country in terms of its GDP per head and this sort of thing. Getting some of that into England and getting meaningful transfer of power and wealth into the hands of people outside of basically the City of London and Westminster would be a very good, positive, progressive thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I mean, really, do you need to get banks? Do you need to organise banks to do that? Really, to me, what's at the heart of the UK's problem is, as a whole, is that it's far too centralised. And, it's built all these institutions in London. The civil service is mainly based in London. It's not that huge in comparison to other countries. I think our public sector, 16.3% of the working population, whereas it's more like 30% in Denmark and Norway. And, so obviously the government spends into the economy first. It's spending to pay these civil servants' wages. These civil servants go out and use the theatres and restaurants around about them. And then the charities want to be in London because all the civil service is in London. And then again, more businesses want to be in London because they've got more, people with money to spend in their businesses. I remember when DVLA came to Wales. I mean, it was a huge thing, this huge bit of government infrastructure finally went to Wales. And then, of course, obviously, with devolution, we actually started to get some proper civil servant jobs up in Scotland as well, So this over-centralisation, to me, seems to be at the heart of the problem. They need to get more civil service out and permanent civil service posts all over the UK. If I'm an independence activist. It's too late for me. I'm not interested in that on my level. But, for the rest of England, certainly that needs to happen in my mind. Do you need banks to do that, or you just need to get politicians that need to stop thinking about their country that they're running as a business? It's not a business, surely.
It's interesting you say that. The Tory government we have now, I mean, it's kind of committed to some versions of this. Like, again, it says it's going to do this. So the whole talk about levelling up, which is basically about England. I mean, probably every so often it gets referenced into the rest of the United Kingdom, but really it ends up being about regional inequality inside of England. And at least some of what they've talked about this isn't nothing. Rewriting the rules of the Treasury in terms of how it thinks about investment. So it has a more sort of social character. It will invest in big projects that are meant to be transformative in the rest of the country. That's the Treasury's new rules, say something along those lines. Of course, you still need a political push to make that happen, but it's a change. They've moved some civil service jobs to, where is it, Darlington, up in Yorkshire, actually. And there's a few other places scheduled for this to happen. They are doing bits and pieces of this. But they're not, I don't think, going to do it seriously, because it's not just like, it doesn't hurt. And actually, it can work quite well to move some civil service or other jobs around. I mean, Media City up in Salford has become the linchpin for a sort of media economy up there now. When BBC, wasn't it, who moved some parts of its operation up there some years ago. That it's not just a transfer of a bit of wealth or a few jobs. This is about power as well. And it's about having the capacity to make decisions that affect you and your kind of local area close to where those decisions are going to have an impact. That if we have a world that is the world, but we have a country where currently a lot of the decisions that affect those local areas are basically taken, not even necessarily in London, they can be taken many thousands of miles away, a very, very long way from where anyone is, and you directly feel the impact of this. That's not democratic, and it's not going to turn into the best things for your area. New Labour had a attempt at a solution to this, which was basically just go, okay, we'll let the City of London carry on, we'll let it off the leash. It's got an independent Bank of England, light touch regulation, as they called it, financial services boom, and all we do is kind of scrape a bit off the top and put it into and spend it on some public spending in the rest of the country, right? So you sort of redistribute through the tax money that you're getting there. That's fine for as long as the City of London is in fact booming. When it crashes, you get the exact opposite, which is you suck all the money out of the rest of the country and pile it into the City of London to keep the thing on the road. That's what austerity boils down to, right? So this isn't in any way a long-term sustainable way of doing things. You have to transfer power as well as wealth. So that does mean institutions like banks and local banking institutions as a way, because banks are powerful. Like if you have a bank, you can actually start to change how your economy operates around what that bank does. So you have a bank and it has a public mandate, a public service mandate. You say this utility, it's there to provide for small businesses, jobs locally, green investment, whatever it might be. That's a powerful tool you can have. And if you say this is under some form of democratic control, it's even more powerful. That's how you're going to reshape these places. But I think it's also just a direct need for a transfer of wealth. I think we need a wealth tax, and the proceeds of that wealth tax have to be spent outside of. I say London. I mean, London does have huge inequality. And it sometimes gets used as shorthand, and people sometimes forget this. But really, it's a little bit of London geographically that's making this happen, and a few people attached to this. But there needs to be a redistribution across everybody else from the massive piles of wealth that have grown up, in particular during the COVID crisis. Very good paper. I mean, by the way, the acceleration of growth of the wealthiest during COVID is extraordinary to behold. What happened? Whilst everybody else, whilst the whole world is basically suffering, people at the very top were doing exceptionally well out of this, like better than they had done for the years beforehand, and they were doing well during the years beforehand. Very good paper by LSE and Warwick economists that says 1% tax on millionaires, which is 1.7% tax on millionaires, raises £250 billion in Britain. I mean, that's a huge sum of money. You can even do it as a one-off. You just say, okay, you've done very well during COVID. We'll take that as a one-off, and it's going to go into long-term investment. You set up a sovereign wealth fund, which is something we should have done years ago. You build institutions at a local level, like new banks, that can make that happen. You can do all of this, but you need to have a bit of thinking about actually redistribution is good and necessary, rather than like, oh, we can't do that because they're all wealth creators and the rest of us have to sort of tag along with it.
Yeah, but I mean, really, the government doesn't need to tax in order to spend. But why it does need to tax is for behavioural problems. And for example, there's some new legislation going very slowly through the House of Commons, too slowly, really, to help with the nefariousness of Russian money investment here. And it's all very well putting the bill through, but HMRC has been decimated. If you don't actually have the civil servants in place to enforce, then it's, you can write as many bills as you want, but if there's no staff to make it happen, the enforcement's not going to happen, and people are just going to slip through the net and then become super rich, and then that's going to come back as dark money, and it has done already. And we've already been affected by this, and so is the the Trump presidency is because of that as well. I think people in this country are asleep at the wheel and not really understanding why you don't want the rich to be too rich. There's a very serious reason why you don't want them to be too rich.
Yeah, it distorts everything else you can think of, right? I mean, there's a basic sort of injustice about this, but there's exactly as you say, there's the risks to how democracies function. One, you have very large concentrations of wealth that are beyond public oversight, and if you stash everything in a tax haven, that's kind of fundamentally what's happening there. So, and look, the Russian oligarch issue is the most obvious sort of public version of this. You have variants of that problem, of the sheer volumes of cash. People might have seen, I think it was the Sunday Times expose a couple of weeks ago on the amount of money that very rich people were putting into the Conservative Party effectively for access to senior ministers, including the Prime Minister, right? That's what's happened when you have large concentrations of wealth. It distorts how your politics functions, and not in a good way, not in a way that is to the benefit, obviously, of most people. I'd just say on taxing, I think we should be quite careful about whether or not you need to tax or not. I mean, there's a particular issue that once you have a tax in place and it is providing funding for a service over a period of time, or at least the funding that's coming in here is kind of matched to the services that you're also providing. Because like I say, on a technical level, the government doesn't actually get your money in and then go off and spend it. It spends the money and then it sort of gets in some money from elsewhere at some other point. There's not like one big pot of cash it spends out of. It's just not how it works. But if it has the tax coming in, that's always something that's there that this government can point to, and any future government knows is there, and it makes it harder to say, okay, we're going to cut this spending because the tax is there. So you remove some of the arguments around debts and deficits that are otherwise start to get built in. So for instance, when you had the 2008 crisis, the rise in the deficit, unfairly, did get used by the Tories as a way of justifying austerity. Now, austerity is something they probably more or less bunch of them wanted to do anyway, right? But nonetheless, it was used as a very, very good reason, as far as they're concerned, to cut away at spending. Whereas if you got the taxes there, that reduces the sort of political impact. So,
on a deeply fundamental level, the government doesn't need to tax to spend, but the saying that you need to bring down the deficit by charging the poorest people on national insurance and meanwhile letting very rich people get away with, because you're not enforcing taxation upon them because you've decimated HMRC and there's no enforcement of taxation. It's just completely crazy, and I think a lot of people are starting to become more aware of that now. I think actually this war has probably highlighted it quite a lot. I don't know if you realise there's a guy who's written a book called Moneyland, James Bullough, and he's been on Scottish radio twice recently speaking about his book, and there's another book coming out about this as well. So more and more people are starting to get aware of just how toxic this dark money is, and also just how toxic it is for our society when the small amount of people become very rich. And not only is it toxic for our democracy, the other thing it's really toxic for is for the environment, because their elite spending is causing a big problem when they're jetting forward and backward, or whatever it is they're spending money on. And sometimes they're spending money on things that are completely ridiculous and they don't need, and it's all about status, and this is a sickness in our society, really.
Oh, I agree with you. No, I agree with you completely about that. That the environmental impact of the very rich is massively larger than the environmental impact of, for example, the poorest 50% of humanity. I mean, Oxfam now regularly produces studies around, I think so, like every year they do a sort of assessment of this, and every year it comes out the same, that it is a tiny fraction of humanity whose consumption is having this overwhelmingly disproportionate impact on the environment. And that's climate change most obviously, but then lots and lots of other resources being used up there. I mean, distribution of flying I always find incredible. Like the number of flights that are taken basically by the top sort of 10% of the population is far in excess. Most people every year most people either fly once or not at all. And then you've got a tiny number of people who are taking frequent flying, it's business trips, or it's second homes elsewhere in Europe, for example, that they're taking frequent flights. And that is a huge contributor to the overall impact of flying. When most people, it's like you either don't fly or it's once for a family holiday. So you can see this creeping out everywhere. And it's exactly that inequality impact that turns up also in the environmental impact. So I completely agree with you about that.
That view from Scotland is this is a perfect example where we see a Labour administration doing something very similar to a Conservative administration, and that using national insurance as a tax on the poor to explicitly this has been taken from you to fund something where we all know that they don't need that money. And over the last 6 months, I've been looking through Labour politicians' feeds to see the ones who are going to raise their heads above parapet to say, we do not need this. We do not need to tax to spend. But I can't find a single senior Labour politician who believes or is happy to say that governments can run and should run a bigger deficit to pay for the things that the government needs. And that's a really weird position. I'm sure for you have been someone on the left, but from Scots who are progressive, looking at the choices that we have in Westminster, it really does look like those kind of, that muddy purple rather than the blue and the red. Do you have a similar perspective to that?
I think there's something interesting that's happened, which is that the deficit and the national debt have really fallen away as a discussion at this point in time. I mean, if you take the period it's basically from 2008 onwards when the Tories started really pushing this. So just immediately after the crisis, they responded very rapidly. George Osborne was committed to Labour's spending plans from when he became Shadow Chancellor in 2005, all the way through to 2008, when the crisis erupted. He immediately said, no, Labour spent too much, and the debt's too big, deficit's too big. And they harp on about this for like a decade and more afterwards. Debt and the deficit, terrible, terrible. Coronavirus hits, both of them explode. The government debt now as a share of GDP is astronomically higher than it was even coming out of the crisis in 2007-8. Right, the deficit has grown enormously because you're paying for furlough, NHS spending, PPE. Even if you don't necessarily get all the PPE, you're paying for all your Tory mates to have a nice bung, as it turns out, all sorts of things. But you run a huge deficit, and it just doesn't feature in political conversation at the minute. And there's this weird sort of way it's disappeared. Now, that does kind of demonstrate that it was always a little bit of a nonsense to really talk this up to the skies. And I'm sort of pleased that at least that part of the argument may well have been won. I think we should keep an eye on it because it can come back. But we seem to have won the argument that, OK, we're just going to spend and ignore the deficit. But I think you are right that there is a sort of weird consensus between the two main Westminster parties on this, in that neither of them are really talking about this. Now, Labour isn't saying very much of what it would do instead, but at least they're not at the point of saying, oh, we're going to shrink the deficit as fast as possible, for example, which was clearly an option. Like if somebody had sort of been bonked on the head and decided we've got to do a kind of weird, very weird version of Blairism where you're going to do this, maybe they'd end up doing that, but I don't quite see it at the minute. It's a relatively positive shift, but it doesn't really do the job. They're saying actually inequality is a massive problem. We're going to have to spend a lot of money on green transformation one way or the other. You've not really got that far yet.
I'm just really interested to hear that you don't think that the Conservative government right now are talking about that we need to bring back public spending under control, and we have Rishi Sunak, who is absolutely, we'll find some quotes for the show, but is saying that we cannot keep paying for this. We have to start paying down the debt for the sake of our children.
Yeah, he says it all the time. And what does he do? He says it all the time. And what does he do?
But we're still in a situation at the moment where they can still say we're recovering from the crisis. But I mean, it's got the potential to supercharge austerity when we're looking to get this deficit down.
I don't think. I mean, the entirety of the kind of sort of elite conversation about this, I think, has changed from 2008. Dig out the Economist, which is very striking. Example. The conversation in The Economist in 2008, I remember, because from sins you end up reading it, is all about, the government's too big, we're going to have to cut away at it, that's what's going to happen. Now it's like, oh dear, we have an ageing society and it's not very productive, we're just going to have a bigger government. Now, that doesn't mean a whole load of other things aren't going to get chiseled away at, like in particular sort of welfare spending in various forms, seems like an obvious one. But the Tory government we have right now, and Boris Johnson did this very deliberately, very, very intentionally, as a way of like basically kneecapping Jeremy Corbyn's Labour, was the first thing he did on arriving in office was to immediately increase public spending in things that people really like, which was schools, police, and the NHS. Public spending was already rising before coronavirus. Then we had coronavirus, it goes through the roof, and now we're sort of out of the first bit of coronavirus. Bear in mind, it hasn't gone away, and one of the impacts of it, the Health Fund estimates, and this is an early estimate, would be it's another £10 billion a year in the NHS that you're going to need to pay for the long-term costs of this. So even without that coronavirus spending, Rishi Sunak has penciled in more government spending as a share of GDP than you had under Tony Blair. Now, it's different spending. The welfare state, the benefits people get are less generous. The NHS is eating up more, but able to do less because there's more demand on it. Schools funding fell per pupil, and they're now trying to pull it back up to what it was in 2010. So it's a different distribution of spending, but now they're also chucking in, let's have a big increase in defence. So to me, this looks like the government's going to be bigger, and probably they're going to turn around at some point and say, all you people who aren't rich are going to have to pay for it. So the national insurance contributions. And if you look at what Rishi Sunak says, he tends towards something like that. I want to reduce taxes, but only when it's responsible to do so. So in other words, it's quite like this. You sort of keep taxes quite high, carry on spending quite a lot, but then always say in the future will be something else. It's as I said before, it's like St. Augustine, his prayer. Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. I mean, this is Rishi Sunak's approach to fiscal conservatives. And one day I'll spend less, not now, but I truly believe that this will happen one day. And he keeps saying it. And look, it's part of his leadership campaign. He has to say it to the Tory faithful because that's the old-time religion they want to hear. What he actually does in practice, something quite different.
Do you not think it would be better if politicians, and I know some of them do understand this, we're upfront about the money supply and what it's for. And the money supply is to enable really people to exchange goods and services with each other and make things happen in a country. It's not to be stored up in bank accounts, just hanging about there doing nothing, and that's where I think the government should always be looking to tax. Where is it hanging about doing nothing? Get it back and reduce the deficit that way. Getting it off of people through national insurance is just so regressive. So I'm all for them reducing the money supply and paying the deficit down, but go and get the money that's sitting doing nothing and get it back.
People really underestimate this, and it's something that doesn't get spoken about enough. But the amount that is now sitting effectively in company, particularly big company, not small businesses, because they've been really quite squeezed for a while, but big business bank accounts is something over £800 billion now. In fact, it's approaching 900 billion last I checked. Right, it's a colossal amount of money that's literally just sitting there. Literally in their bank accounts. It's not like, it's not a pile of gold, but it is a number in a bank that represents what those companies have to hand. And it is doing precisely nothing. Because what's happening to business investment? What's happening to the amount of pay that they're paying their workers, for instance? It's not doing anything any use to anybody. So you've got to get that money out of this hoard that is being built up. And it's accelerated in the last few years, of course, in parallel with just wealthy individuals hoarding money. Big companies have hoarded money as well. Get that out of those bank accounts, get it into the wider economy where it can do some use. And that's going to involve taxes, and that's going to involve a conversation about what are we doing with the resources of this society that isn't just give it all to the rich people, give it all to the biggest corporation we can find, hope for the best.
How much of a driver do you think the climate crisis is in changing the way that we run our economy and our society?
Well, probably not enough. I mean, to be honest with you, it's not had. There's lots of sort of warm words, so to speak, around these things, and a certain amount of investment has happened. This Tory government is very keen to talk up how actually we've got loads of renewable investment now, and isn't that great? And this is how we're going to proceed into the future. I don't think this addresses the seriousness, not just of the climate crisis, but a kind of wider resource crisis, biodiversity loss, the whole range of impacts we're having on the natural world in one form or another that aren't being seriously factored into how we organise our economy, and certainly not seriously factored into how this government is approaching this. I don't think the idea that you offer a few incentives to the free market and it will provide enough for all of this to happen is anything like serious enough. And also, incidentally, when you say some of their preferred solutions, like a rapid switch so that everybody has an electric vehicle, themselves impose massive resource demands. Where are you going to get the lithium from? Where are you going to mine it from in order to build all those batteries so you can run all those electric cars? It's just not particularly well thought through. So in terms of what government is doing, the British government, it's had some impact, and I think public concern has really pushed it. It's had the impact where, you have Boris Johnson talking about this, a manifesto commitment in 2019 manifesto to this. But it's not had nearly enough to get them to actually deliver. And of course, there are now noises off from people like Nigel Farage saying, well, what's the point? We should all just go fracking instead. So there's things have shifted. They've not quite turned into, and we're a long way from turning into the kind of action that we actually need on this.
An argument that we hear from a lot of Labour supporters in Scotland is that when you're not happy with the government, you change the government and not your country. And, that's a very powerful argument. But when we're looking at two administrations in Westminster that have got a lot of similar policies, can you see why that comment just kind of looks really outdated?
I can't see why. I mean, also, you change your government to change your country, right? So, and changing your country ought to be a bigger conversation than just like, okay, we'll shuffle the government around and all the institutions stay the same. I mean, what we really need, and it's not just in Scotland, what you need across the whole of the United Kingdom is a big conversation about the kind of institutions we have, because the institutions we have are not delivering for most people. Right? There's a series of basically institutional failures. That ultimately gets you to a big constitutional question. If you're serious about institutional reform, you end up talking about what is the constitution of your country you're in. And there's a range of different answers to that, of which Scottish independence is a version of addressing that constitutional question. That's a decision for people in Scotland to make. For people in England, then we can't really be independent, but you can certainly think about what might be the institutions outside of Westminster, new institutions that are more democratic, closer in touch with people, and have some meaningful power to change people's lives. That isn't just, okay, here's a mayor, can do a few things, can't do, or she can do a few things, can't do very much. It's actually like, can you create tax raising powers for them? Can you set up new banking institutions? Can you do these things that will really shift power inside of England? And that's a sort of deep question that isn't just shuffle whoever's in charge at Westminster. That's like really fundamental reform.
Yeah, and we have that potential for that institutional reform because we have two parties in power who support a constitutional change in independence. But where do the people of England go for that alternative? Who do they vote for to see the institutional change that the country needs? Where is their democratic route to that potentially different society?
Well, it's building up ahead of steam. I mean, the Labour's the campaign for a new democracy inside of Labour, in other words, basically a campaign for electoral reform, which is a kind of first step towards this, is already building up support. Unite has come out in favour of it. Previously, it's the third time I mentioned it, Andy Burnham said he supports it now. There's quite powerful figures in the Labour movement, big institutions moving in this direction, because there's a recognition really that first past the post is not serving anybody particularly well. And in particular, it's actually not serving people in England particularly well, because there's no other representation that they get of any meaningful sense here. So that's one part of it. I think there's probably a much bigger question that we can start to see building up around what has happened with inadvertently, because I don't think the Tories intended this to happen at all. It was George Osborne who launched the whole round of let's create some metro mayors and this sort of thing. They did not intend to create thorns in their side. That was not what they wanted, but they have done that, and that's good, and that's something to build on. So I think there's a head of steam building up around the demands that the mayors themselves are raising for more powers, and potentially looking to other parts of the country and building similar institutions. So it's not going to be like necessarily one big shift at Westminster. Here's your new political force that will deliver that. But I think inside the Labour Party, and potentially in alliance with some of the other smaller parties, Greens and Lib Dems are the most obvious ones here, you can start to see some of that change taking place.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. I don't know if you've seen this website. It's called ourdemocracy.scot. It gives you the statistics on local representation. So, for example, the area that I have, you have one councillor for 4,743 people. In England, that's averagely about 2,814 people.
Right.
But in Norway would have 572 people would be represented by one councillor. So, we really, really need a lot more democracy. And it's no wonder that people are disillusioned. I was out canvassing yesterday, actually, last night, and, a woman said to me, I just don't bother. And it infuriates me because I'm seeing Russians on the street being put in prison because their democracy is so dysfunctional. And we have the potential to have a better democracy, but some people can't even be bothered. And I think some people can't be bothered because they feel so far away from it. And they are far away from it. Literally, they are. And, we need more subsidiarity. And it's not just that I want to see Scotland be independent. I want to see much more subsidiarity after that as well, And I think you're right. In England, that definitely has to happen. And the first past the post system isn't serving anyone. But I would say to the Lib Dems and the Labour Party, you need to get yourself out of the House of Lords and just make it a non-functioning second house and do that protest right now.
Well, there's a lot of things that the British Labour Party could do as well by using Scotland as this kind of wedge on the constitution. But for some reason, the Labour Party is not open to the debate of supporting in Scottish independence. And that would allow the UK to start looking at all of these. It looks like a solution for a very different problem for England, rather than trying to go down this much longer route, to be actively supporting a constitutional shake-up in Scotland and in Wales. And would eventually lead to maybe that position where you would like to see in the rest of the UK.
Yeah, I agree. No, I mean, the thing needs a shake-up, and Labour's, it's for Scottish Labour to decide these things, but it's Scottish Labour's dogged commitment to the union and sort of pretty much refusal to consider, even within the union, what it is you might do that would be different. Like, what kind of radical federalism might you have? You don't want independence. Maybe you sort of go this far. I think is a real problem for it. It's a problem where you look at, I could just see it from direct experience with Corbynism, that you had a big surge in Labour membership in Wales and in England. Like lots and lots of young people joining. Doesn't happen in Scotland. It happens a bit, but it's nothing to like the same extent. And there's a kind of reason for that. And it's kind of built into Scottish Labour's absolute refusal to go anywhere near the sets of questions that have actually engaged lots and lots of young people in Scottish politics over the last, probably about nearly 10 years now, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah. Thanks so much. And we've learned a lot from you. I'm sure our audience and our viewers have too.
Thank you for having me. Cheers, Ed.
Thanks so much. Bye now.
See you later.
Welcome back, everyone. Karen, welcome back. And thank you so much to all those who stayed through that whole interview. I think there's really good comments on the chat and a lot of engagement. I thought it was really, really interesting, and I think it's so crucial for us to hear voices outside of the movement. And I think a lot of the things that James said in his perspective on Scottish Labour, I found absolutely fascinating. What about you watching that again, Kieran? Any thoughts?
I guess the most shocking figure, I think, is the 900 billion that's sitting in business bank accounts, literally doing nothing. This is something I've been reading about for a number of years. That there is this huge amount of money just hanging about, literally doing nothing, and we have people who can barely feed themselves and their children and keep their houses warm. It's an abomination, and it needs to be stopped.
Yeah, absolutely. And to the same point, is the fact that the government are paying down the debt as quickly as they can. And as I said in the chat there, I had a disagreement with James. I thought he was wrong, and whether or not I've been proved right or wrong, I think I have. After the statement today from the Chancellor, I'll let other people decide that. But it's really clear that the government is intent on paying down this debt, which means it's pulling money out of the economy, and it's going to push us into recession, if not quite that far, then certainly a lot more problems. And considering we've got a cost of living crisis, the government should be using that money, using that deficit to support the country, not taking that money out to pay back people who don't need that effectively with the interest payments. So huge amount that we covered, and a lot of comments on debt and deficit, which seems to be something that just continually comes up, that difficulty in understanding that the government debt isn't your debt, and that it's also not really a debt. So thank you, Jackie, for a lot of the comments that you covered on that. We've got a brilliant bite-sized episode on debt, which I've just got to finish editing, but I really recommend that to anyone who's still a little bit confused about what the government debt is and would Scotland have to pay it back on independence. So that's my thoughts. Kieran, any points, anything before we want to head off?
I think I made lots of points about the budget at the beginning. There's just I mean, it's a Tory budget. It's kind of what we expect from the right politically, and they are really far to the right, this lot. So it's kind of what we expect, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, thanks everyone for joining us this evening, and it's worth saying that actually we had an even longer conversation with James, and on Patreon we've got all of the full conversation. So James told us what he thought about the impact of China and the war in Ukraine and what impact it could have on Russia. He also spoke about, which I thought was fascinating, the advice that he would have given, considering he was the advisor to the Shadow Chancellor. What advice would he have given to the Chancellor during COVID? We asked him if he thought eat out to help out was a good idea. I bet you can guess what his answer was. And we also asked him quite a lot of stuff around bonds and central banks. So if you do want to hear that, and if you do, or if you can contribute towards our Patreon, that would be absolutely fantastic. I'll just put the details up there. But a full longer interview, and also you and I go into a lot more in depth about James's answers as well on that. But please join us on there if you can. If not, we'll see you again next week. And we've got a really interesting interview around financial services and looking at the kind of choice between Scotland's banking system being the same and current what we've got in Westminster, and also this much more kind of traditional, I suppose in a sense, Presbyterian Scottish way of banking, which is what the Canadian banking system is. So that's a really interesting episode coming up next week. Until then, thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Good night.
Good night. Bye all.